The dust motes dance in the slanted afternoon light, each one a tiny, golden world turning in the quiet of my living room. It's a peaceful quiet, the kind that settles into the bones after a long life. It's made of the gentle tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the whisper of my own soft breathing. This quiet is a comfort. It is nothing like the other kind of quiet, the one I grew up with, the loud, ringing silence of a house holding its breath. My hands tremble slightly, a betrayal of the calm I try so hard to project. The skin is thin now, a delicate latticework of veins and age spots over knuckles that once gripped tricycle handlebars and, later, the edges of a school desk. Now, they grip a silver frame, its surface cool against my fingertips. Inside rests a ghost, a frozen moment from a time that feels both a lifetime ago and as painfully immediate as my next heartbeat. It's a family portrait, taken in the autumn of the year the leaves turned a particularly brilliant shade of crimson, just before the first snows came to bury the world in white. People in Havenwood always said we were the perfect family, the Hayes family. And in the photograph, we certainly look the part. There is my father, Richard Hayes, standing tall and broad-shouldered. His smile is a masterpiece of public relations, the kind that won him customers at the hardware store and a respected seat on the town council. It's a handsome, confident smile that promises integrity and strength. He could, as the saying went, charm a bird from a tree. I used to watch him do it. His voice a warm, booming melody that wrapped around people and made them feel seen, important. In the photograph, his hand rests on my shoulder, a gesture of paternal pride for the whole world to see. Beside him, my mother, Eleanor, is the very picture of grace. Her hair is perfectly coiffed, her dress impeccably tailored. She is beautiful, but it's a fragile, porcelain beauty. You have to look closely to see it, to notice the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her smile is a perfect, practiced curve that doesn't quite soften the guarded look in her eyes. Her hand rests on my other shoulder, but her grip, I remember, was a little too tight, her fingers pressing into my skin as if to hold me in place, to remind me of my part in this carefully staged production. And then there's me. A slip of a girl no older than 10, with a plaid wool dress that itched at my neck and 2 neat braids that Eleanor had plaited so tightly my eyes felt pulled at the corners. My smile is a pale imitation of my parents'. It's the smile of a child who has been told to look happy for the nice man, a vacant, obedient upward turn of the lips. The photograph doesn't lie. That was us. That was our family. It just doesn't tell the whole truth. It captures the image, but it misses the sound, the sharp, indrawn breath of my mother whenever my father entered a room. It misses the feeling, the cold dread that pooled in my stomach when I heard the jingle of his keys in the door. And it misses the story buried deep in the girl's eyes, a story of wanting so desperately to believe in the beautiful lie she was forced to perform. My father passed away last week. The funeral was large, just as he would have wanted. The church was overflowing with people whose lives he had touched in some small public way. A discount on paint, a piece of fatherly advice given over a countertop, a generous donation to the annual town picnic. They came to my side, one after another, their faces masks of gentle pity. They took my hand, their grip soft and fleeting. "He was such a good man, Lily," they'd say. "A true pillar of this community." An old friend of my mother's dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "You were so lucky to have him, dear." "Your father adored you." I nodded and murmured my thanks, playing my final role as the grieving daughter. But I didn't cry, not a single tear for the man they were eulogizing. The well of my tears for him ran dry decades ago. No, as I sat in the front pew, staring at the polished mahogany casket, I cried for the girl in this picture. I cried for her itchy dress and her tight braids. I cried for her desperate, hollow smile. I cried for the silence she learned to live in, for the parts of her that had to be hidden away so this photograph could exist. I cried because for 60 years she has been trapped in this silver frame, her story untold. The house has been sold. The relatives have all gone home, their duty done, their share of the casserole dishes returned. The quiet has descended once more, but today it feels different. It's not an ending, it's a beginning. This photograph, this relic of a life built on a lie, is all I have left of them. I trace the glass over my mother's tense face, my father's confident smile. My finger comes to rest on the face of the little girl. Her eyes stare back at me, a silent plea across the chasm of years, and I am finally going to answer her. I'm about to finally let her speak. My story doesn't begin with a single cataclysmic event. It begins with a sound. The sound of his keys in the front door. To understand the girl in the photograph, you must understand the house she lived in. It wasn't just wood and plaster. It was a living, breathing thing, and its lungs were filled with my father's moods. His mood was the weather in our house. We all lived in fear of the storm. There could be hours, sometimes even a full day, of what felt like sunshine. Those were the times I could lose myself in the pages of a book, my bedroom door ajar, the afternoon light warm on the wooden floor. In those years, when the world still seemed painted in simple, primary colors, my room was my sanctuary. The shelves were lined with stories of girls who went on adventures, who solved mysteries, who were brave and clever and free. I would lie on my bed, the book propped on my chest, and travel with them to ancient castles and distant shores, the scent of paper and ink filling my head. In those moments, the house was quiet, and I could almost believe it was peaceful. I was 15, lost somewhere in the fields of Prince Edward Island with Anne Shirley, when the spell was broken. It started, as it always did, with the low crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. It was a sound that vibrated up through the floorboards, a subtle tremor that signaled the end of the day's peace. My breath would catch in my throat. The words on the page would blur. I'd listen, my body perfectly still, for the next sound in the sequence, the heavy slam of a car door, the confident, measured crunch of his footsteps on the path, and then the final, sharp announcement. The metallic scrape of a key in the lock, followed by the decisive click of the tumbler. That sound was a switch. In an instant, the entire atmosphere of the house shifted. The barometric pressure plummeted. It was as if the air itself grew thick and heavy, charged with a nervous energy that demanded vigilance. From the living room below, I heard the frantic rustle of my mother gathering her newspaper and knitting, the soft, hurried thud of her feet on the rug as she moved to her station by the door. She was the weather vane, frantically spinning to gauge the direction of the wind before it began to howl. "Hello, my girls, I'm home!" His voice was a boom, a cheerful, expansive sound designed to fill every corner of the house with his presence. It was the voice he used with customers, the one that made him seem like the most generous, good-natured man in all of Havenwood. I remained in my room, melting back into the shadows. My book lay forgotten on my chest. This was the most dangerous time. The first 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, the forecast for the entire evening would be set. I learned to read the nuances not from his words, but from the silence that followed them. "Richard, welcome home, dear," my mother's voice chirped, a little too high, a little too bright. "How was your day?" "Busy, Eleanor, always busy," he said. I could hear him shrugging off his coat, the heavy wool thudding onto the hall chair. I pictured him scanning the room, his eyes missing nothing. He was a man who believed the world was a reflection of himself, and he demanded that reflection be flawless. "Did Mrs. Gable happen to stop by today?" A beat of silence. My mother's internal gears were spinning. Was this a trick question? "No, dear," she said cautiously. "She's coming tomorrow for tea. Why do you ask?" "No reason," he said, his voice still light, but I knew what was coming. It was the verbal equivalent of a cloud passing over the sun. "It's just that the curtains in the front window look a little crooked from the street. They've been that way all day." "You know how I feel about first impressions. This is our home. It shows the town who we are." It wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was a statement of fact that carried the full weight of her failure. It wasn't about the curtains. It was about her not seeing what he saw, not anticipating his displeasure. It was about her letting a flaw, however minor, be visible to the outside world. "Oh. Goodness, I didn't even notice," she flustered, and I heard her quick, nervous steps as she rushed to the window. "I'll fix them right now. I was just in the middle of preparing the roast. I must have been distracted." The apologies tumbled out of her, a cascade of excuses designed to build a dam against his rising irritation. I pressed my back against my bedroom wall, making myself smaller, quieter. I was a ghost, a silent observer of this nightly ritual. My mother's entire existence was dedicated to this art of prediction, to smoothing his path, to calming the winds. She pruned away any of her own desires that might snag on his temper. She taught me to do the same, not with lessons, but with her own frantic, anxious example. Her love was a cage built of warnings, and the bars were forged in the fire of my father's unpredictable moods. The girl in the photograph, with her stiff posture and obedient smile, was born in these moments. She learned that safety was found in stillness, that survival was found in silence, and that love, in our house, was just another word for fear. If my father's temper was the weather, then my mother was the priestess of a strange and terrified cult, and the first commandment of her faith was silence. She taught me its scripture not in grand sermons, but in small, hushed whispers in the quiet corners of the house. The lesson I remember most clearly was delivered over a bowl of flour in the sun-drenched kitchen a few days after the incident with the curtains. The air was warm and smelled of yeast and cinnamon, a perfect illusion of domestic bliss. For a few moments, it was just the two of us, mother and daughter, rolling out dough for her famous cinnamon buns, a treat reserved for the church bake sale. It was a rare moment of shared, peaceful activity, and in my youthful foolishness, I mistook it for intimacy. A boy at school, Michael O'Connell, had carried my books for me when I'd dropped them in the crowded hallway. He had red hair and a constellation of freckles across his nose, and when he smiled, he looked genuinely kind. It was nothing. It was a fleeting moment of simple, uncomplicated courtesy. But in my small gray world, it had felt like a sliver of sunlight. I wanted to share it with her. I wanted to see her smile, to have her be happy for me, to feel, for just a second, like a normal girl. "Mother," I began, my voice hesitant as I sprinkled flour across the wooden board. "A funny thing happened at school today." Her hands, rhythmically kneading a ball of dough, faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was almost imperceptible, but I had spent my life learning to read her tremors. "Oh?" she said, her voice maintaining its light, pleasant tone. "What was that, dear?" "My books," I said, trying to sound casual. "I dropped them all near the lockers, and Michael O'Connell, from the pharmacy, his son, he stopped and helped me pick them all up. He was very nice about it." I watched her face for the reaction I craved, a smile, a gentle nod. Instead, I saw her glance, quick as a frightened bird, towards the kitchen door, as if my father might materialize from the ether. Her hands resumed their work, but now the motion was tighter, more frantic. The dough was being punished. "Well, that was polite of him," she said, her focus entirely on the dough before her. "But Lily, you must be careful." "Careful?" I asked, my little bubble of happiness beginning to deflate. "Why?" "He was just being friendly." She sighed, a soft, weary sound, and finally stopped her work. She wiped her floured hands on her apron and turned to me. Her eyes were filled with a familiar, anxious pity that I had learned to dread. "Honey, you're growing up, you're becoming a young woman, and boys can be complicated. It's best not to draw too much attention, especially from boys." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know how your father worries. He only wants what's best for you, and he wouldn't want people in town getting the wrong impression." The wrong impression. It was the Hayes family's cardinal sin. It was the ghost that haunted every room, the unspoken fear behind every decision. It wasn't about my safety or my happiness. It was about preserving the flawless facade of the family in the photograph. Michael O'Connell's simple act of kindness was not a gift. It was a threat. It was a variable she couldn't control, a spotlight that might drift towards me and by extension them. It might give my father a reason to worry. That day, I learned the fundamental tenet of Mother's law of silence. It wasn't just about not speaking of the bad things. It was about not speaking of the good things either. It was about not speaking of anything that made you an individual, anything that drew a circle around yourself and separated you from the tightly controlled family unit. Her warnings became the soundtrack to my adolescence. When I thought of trying out for the school play, "Oh, Lily, think of the late nights, all that attention. It's not for a girl like you." The translation was clear. Don't be seen. When I timidly voiced a differing opinion on politics at the dinner table, "Now, Lily, your father knows best about these things." Let it go. The translation, don't have a voice. When a friend invited me for a sleepover, "I don't know, dear. We don't really know her parents that well. It's better to just stay home with family." The translation, don't form outside allegiances. Don't upset your father. Let it go, Lily. We don't talk about such things. Her love was a cage built of these warnings. For years, I believed she was trying to protect me, that she was standing between me and the storm. It was only much later, as I held this faded photograph in my trembling hands, that I understood the terrible, heartbreaking truth. My mother wasn't a shield. She was a sacrifice. She was feeding the monster small, palatable pieces of my spirit, my joy, and my hope, day after day, to keep him from turning his full, ravenous appetite on her. She wasn't protecting me from the storm. She was tying me to the mast so she wouldn't be washed overboard herself. It happened in the autumn I turned 16. The world outside my window had turned to rust and gold, and a chill was beginning to thread its way through the evening air. By then, I had become an expert in my mother's laws. My voice was quiet. My opinions were folded away like old linens, and my presence in the house was as unobtrusive as a shadow on the wall. I had learned to live in the narrow spaces her fear afforded me, and I thought that if I made myself small enough, if I became utterly invisible, I would be safe. It is a terrible and foolish thing, the logic of a trapped animal. You think the cage will protect you, right up until you realize it was built to keep the monster in, not out. My most treasured possession was a small, lacquered music box that sat on my dresser. It had been a gift from my grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman who had died before I could truly know her, but who existed for me in the form of this one perfect object. It was painted with delicate white roses, and when you opened the lid, a tiny ballerina with a porcelain face would slowly turn to the gentle, tinkling melody of Brahms' lullaby. It was the only thing in my room, in my entire life, that felt completely and truly mine. It was a sound of pure, uncomplicated peace. In a house of loaded silences and booming threats, those few notes were a sanctuary. That night, the house was quiet. My father had been in a good mood at dinner, his voice full of praise for my mother's pot roast. The weather in our home was calm, the sky clear. I went to bed feeling that rare, fragile sense of ease. I lay under the covers, tracing the patterns on my quilt in the dim light from the hallway, listening to the old house settle around me. The groan of a floorboard, the sigh of the pipes, these were familiar, comforting sounds. I was in my room. My door was closed. I was safe. The door creaked open. I froze, my hand still on the quilt. He stood there for a moment, a large silhouette against the hallway light. The faint, cloying scent of his whiskey and aftershave drifted into the room, polluting the clean air. "Lilybug?" he whispered, using a childhood nickname that now felt grotesque and wrong on his lips. "You asleep?" I didn't answer. I feigned sleep, a tactic I had used since I was small, my breathing deep and even, my body perfectly still. Sometimes it worked. He would watch me for a moment, then retreat, closing the door behind him. Tonight, he entered. His heavy footsteps were unnervingly quiet on my rug. I could feel his presence beside my bed, a mountain of heat and shadow. "Just wanted to tuck my little girl in tight," he murmured. His voice was thick, syrupy, an imitation of fatherly affection. He reached over me, pretending to adjust my blankets. His arm, large and heavy, swept across my dresser in a gesture of feigned clumsiness. The sound was sharp and violent, a crack of wood hitting the floor, followed by the sickening metallic jangle of a mechanism breaking. My eyes flew open. "No!" The cry was ripped from my throat before I could stop it. On the floor, my beautiful music box lay in pieces. The lid was torn from its hinges, the wood splintered. The tiny ballerina lay on her side, her porcelain face chipped, her perpetual smile now a tragic grimace. "Oh, honey. Oh, Lilybug, I'm so sorry," he cooed, kneeling beside my bed. "Daddy's so clumsy," Look what I did. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. They were for the music box, for the one beautiful thing I owned. He saw the tears and he misunderstood them as a child's simple sadness, an opportunity for his brand of comfort. He sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. He pulled me towards him into a suffocating embrace. Shh, don't cry, honey, it's okay. Daddy will buy you a new one. A much better one. He stroked my hair, his hand rough against my scalp. And then, everything changed. His hand slid from my hair down my back, and the nature of the touch shifted. It was no longer paternal. The pressure, the movement, the intention, it all curdled into something I had no name for, something my mind recoiled from in pure, white-hot horror. I went rigid in his arms, every muscle in my body screaming. My breath caught in my lungs, a silent, trapped sob. This was not comfort, this was possession. It was a violation so profound it shattered the very foundations of my world. The man who was supposed to be my protector was the thing I needed protection from. I don't know how long he stayed there. Time ceased to exist. There was only the feeling of his hand on my back, the smell of his breath, and the paralyzing, ice-cold terror that flooded every cell in my body. My mind detached, floating up to a corner of the ceiling, looking down at the girl in the bed, a stranger being held by a monster. When he finally left, he did so without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, plunging the room back into darkness. I lay there, unable to move, feeling defiled and broken. And then, from the floor came a sound. The mechanism inside the shattered music box, in its death throes, began to play. It was a horrible, distorted version of the lullaby. A few discordant notes, slow and dragging, like a memory dying. Tink, plink, tonk, and then silence. That night, he broke more than just a music box. He broke the world, and in the crushing, absolute darkness, my soul screamed for my mother. It was a silent, desperate cry from a daughter who had just been sacrificed. But no one came. The door remained closed, and the house was silent. It was always silent. The silence that followed the night of the broken music box was a new kind of silence. It was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the presence of an unspeakable truth. That night was not an end. It was a beginning. His visits to my room became a horrifying routine, a secret tax levied on my existence within the house. The creak of my door, once a sound that merely startled, now became a sound that unmade me. I learned to survive it. I learned to send my mind away, to a place high in the corner of the ceiling, or deep within the pages of a book I had memorized. I would watch the terrified girl in the bed, as if she were a stranger, my soul detaching from my body until the door clicked shut again and the heavy footsteps receded down the hall. I became a ghost. At school, the words of my teachers became a dull drone, my grades slipping from A's to C's. My friends, the few I had, tried to reach for me, but I was receding from them, pulling away into a fog of shame and fear they couldn't possibly comprehend. "What's wrong, Lily?" they'd ask, their faces etched with a concern I could no longer accept. I would just shake my head, my voice a stranger in my own throat. At home, I moved through the rooms like a whisper, my eyes fixed on the floor. My mother saw. Of course she saw. She saw the new shadows under my eyes, the way I flinched when my father's voice boomed unexpectedly, the way I barely touched the food on my plate. But her law of silence had no scripture for this. This was a truth too monstrous to be acknowledged, so she polished it away. She would comment on the dust on the mantelpiece while I was fading beside her. "You look so pale lately, Lily," she'd say, her gaze fixed on the silverware she was polishing to a blinding sheen. "You must not be sleeping well." Perhaps some tea. She offered remedies for symptoms, refusing to see the disease. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge her own role in it, and the foundations of her carefully constructed world were not built to withstand such a truth. Then, my body began to betray me in a new way. A persistent, cloying nausea greeted me each morning. A weariness so profound settled into my bones that climbing the stairs felt like scaling a mountain. For weeks I told myself it was the stress, a lingering flu. But there was a morning I was lacing my shoes, and a wave of dizziness so intense washed over me that I had to grip the bedpost to keep from falling. In that moment, a new and different kind of terror, cold and clinical, pierced through the fog of my daily dread. A memory from a health class film, a diagram, a calendar, a list of signs, flashed in my mind. It was an impossible thought. A thought so catastrophic I pushed it down, buried it, refused it. But a secret that grows inside you cannot be ignored. It has a heartbeat. It began to make its presence known, a small, persistent drumbeat counting down to my ruin. The terror solidified into a certainty I could no longer deny. I needed to know. The practicalities were a nightmare. In a town like Havenwood, a 16-year-old girl couldn't simply walk into the pharmacy and buy what I needed. It took me 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hoarding the lunch money my mother gave me, of living on an apple and a growing sense of panic. I finally cornered a girl from my art class, a girl who wore dark eyeliner and smoked cigarettes behind the bleachers, a girl who seemed to traffic in the world of secrets. I pushed the crumpled dollar bills into her hand without explanation. I didn't have to. She looked at my pale, desperate face, gave a slow, knowing nod, and the next day, a small, plain cardboard box appeared in my locker. I waited until the house was empty, my father at the store, my mother at her weekly church committee meeting. I locked the bathroom door, the click of the lock sounding like the bolt on a prison cell. My hands shook so violently I could barely tear the box open. The plastic stick felt cold and clinical in my hand. The instructions seemed to be written in a foreign language. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, the cold porcelain pressing against the back of my legs. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime the hour, each bong a hammer blow against my skull. 3 minutes. The instructions said to wait 3 minutes. It was the longest 3 minutes of my life. I stared at the small blank window on the stick, praying to a God I was no longer sure I believed in. Please, no. Please, no. The first blue line appeared almost instantly, sharp and defiant. It was the line that meant the test was working. For a moment, a wild, hysterical hope flared in my chest. Maybe it's broken. Maybe it's wrong. And then, slowly, like a nightmare bleeding into reality, the second line began to emerge. It was fainter at first, a ghost of a line, and I held my breath, bargaining with it, willing it to disappear. But it only grew darker, clearer, more certain. A perfect, irrevocable blue cross. The plastic stick slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the cold tile floor. I couldn't breathe. The air in the small room was thick and unmoving. I looked out the small, steamed-up window above the toilet. A woman I didn't know was in her backyard next door, hanging brightly colored sheets on a clothesline. A small child, her own daughter perhaps, was chasing a butterfly on the lawn. They were living in a world I no longer belonged to. The glass of the window was an invisible wall, and I was on the wrong side of it. They were living in the world of time, of tomorrows, of simple, sunlit afternoons. I was living in the world of a countdown. The secret inside me was no longer a secret. It was a life, and it was the end of mine. For a long time, I remained on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, the world reduced to the porcelain of the toilet bowl and the horrifying blue cross on the plastic stick beside my hand. The initial shock gave way to a tidal wave of panic so immense it threatened to drown me. There was no path forward. Every direction I looked, I saw only ruin, but I couldn't stay there forever. The sound of my mother's car in the driveway, returning from her meeting, was the signal. I had to move, I had to do something, and in the bleak, barren landscape of my options, there was only one person to turn to. A foolish, desperate hope, the kind that only a terrified child can muster, flickered in my chest. She was my mother. Surely she would help me. I picked up the test stick, the plastic now warm from the heat of my hand. It felt like a bomb, and I was the one who had to carry it. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was the same, but my perception of it had been altered. The floral wallpaper seemed to mock me. The portrait of some forgotten ancestor on the wall seemed to stare with accusing eyes. Each step towards her sewing room was a step towards my own judgment day. Her sewing room was her sanctuary, a small, sunlit space at the back of the house overlooking the garden. It was the one place where she was the absolute monarch. Everything was in its place. Spools of thread were arranged in perfect rainbow gradients on wooden pegs. Patterns were neatly filed in labeled boxes. Bolts of fabric were stacked with crisp military precision. It was a world of order, a world she could control, a world where any tear could be mended, any raw edge hemmed into submission. I stood in the doorway, a harbinger of a chaos so profound it could never be stitched back together. She was at her sewing machine, her back to me, the gentle whirring of the motor the only sound in the room. "Mother?" My voice was a dry, cracked whisper. The whirring stopped. She turned, a slight annoyance on her face at being interrupted. "Lily, I was just finishing the hem on Mrs. Gable's dress." "What is it?" Then she saw my face. She saw the object in my hand. Her expression shifted from mild irritation to confusion, and then, as her eyes focused on the two blue lines, to a stark gray horror. For one single, solitary second, I saw my mother. Not the wife of Richard Hayes, not the priestess of silence, but the woman who had given birth to me. Her face crumpled. The carefully constructed mask of serene composure shattered, and I saw a flicker of pure, agonizing pity in her eyes. Her hand even started to lift, her fingers uncurling as if to reach for me across the small space that separated us. In that one beautiful, heartbreaking second, she was with me. And then she was gone. It was as if a shutter had come down. The pity vanished, extinguished by a tidal wave of cold, pragmatic fear. Her eyes, which a moment before had held a glimmer of maternal sympathy, now became hard and calculating. They darted towards the closed door, then back to me. She rose from her chair, her movements stiff and jerky. She crossed the room, not to me, but to the door, checking to make sure it was firmly shut. When she turned back, the woman I had glimpsed was gone forever, replaced by a terrifyingly calm stranger. She did not hug me. She did not comfort me. She marched over to me, snatched the test from my numb fingers, and her own hand, thin and bony, shot out and gripped my upper arm. Her fingers dug in like talons. "No one can ever know," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "Do you understand me? No one." Her eyes were wild. "Do you have any idea what he would do? To you? To me? This will destroy your father, Lily. It will destroy this family. Everything we have, everything he has worked for, will turn to ash." The blame was a physical force, pushing me down, crushing the air from my lungs. It was my fault, not his, mine. Her grip tightened as she began to think, her mind working with a terrifying efficiency. "You're sick," she declared, her voice now stripped of all emotion, becoming cold and clinical. "You have a bad case of mononucleosis. A glandular fever. The doctor will say you need complete bed rest for months. You won't be going back to school. You won't be leaving the house. You won't be seeing anyone. I will call the school principal myself. I will tell the neighbors. I will handle everything." It was not an offer of help. It was a sentence. She was laying out the terms of my imprisonment, her voice as detached as if she were reading a grocery list. I just stared at her, my last flickering ember of hope dying, leaving me in a cold, dark void. In her eyes, I was no longer her daughter. I was a problem to be solved, a bomb to be diffused before it could blow her comfortable world to pieces. And she was willing to sacrifice me, to bury me alive within the walls of this house, to keep the blast from ever reaching the front lawn. "Now," she said, releasing my arm and stepping back, her face a mask of resolute determination. "Go to your room. And don't you dare cry where he can hear you." My bedroom, the place that had been both my sanctuary and the scene of my ruin, was not to be my prison. It was too close, too central. My growing secret was a contagion of shame, and my mother was determined to quarantine it as far as possible from the heart of the house. The official story, delivered in my mother's calm, convincing voice over the telephone to the school principal and a few concerned neighbors, was a severe case of glandular fever. It was a perfect illness, debilitating, requiring long-term isolation and rest, but blessedly non-contagious. It was a lie so well crafted, so medically plausible, that no one questioned it. "It's quieter up here, dear," she told me a week into my sentence, her hands already full with a stack of my folded clothes. You need absolute rest to recover. And it's further away from the main part of the house, so you won't be disturbed. We wouldn't want to tire you." Her words were wrapped in the guise of medical concern, a thin, transparent veil over the truth. What she meant was, "Your belly will start to show soon, and up here, no one can see you." So I became the guest in the attic. The space was a storage room, a graveyard for the family's forgotten things. A single cot with a thin, lumpy mattress was pushed against one wall. A rickety card table and a straight-backed chair served as my desk. The air was thick with the scent of dust, cedar from an old chest, and the faint, papery decay of forgotten documents. A single small half-moon window, set high on the slanted wall, was my only connection to the outside world. It was a room of ghosts, and I was now one of them. The days bled into one another, a monotonous gray watercolor of time. My life was measured in the 3 daily visits from my mother. She would appear with a tray, her face a neutral mask. "Here's your lunch, Lily," she would say, placing it on the card table. "Do you need anything?" The question was a formality. I learned early on not to ask for anything beyond another book. To ask for more would be to demand an interaction, a moment of connection she was unwilling or unable to give. Her eyes, I noticed, never met mine. They would flicker over my changing shape with a quick, anxious glance before finding a neutral spot on the wall behind me. She was my jailer, performing her duties with a cold, detached efficiency. My father never came up. Not once. He was the king of the main floors, the cause of this entire sordid situation, yet he was completely absolved from having to witness its consequences. His sin was my sentence, and my mother was his warden. I read. I reread every book I owned until the ink seemed to fade from the pages and the characters' adventures became a cruel mockery of my own static existence. I stared out my little window for hours. I watched the last of the autumn leaves burn themselves out and fall, leaving the branches of the great oak in the backyard as stark and skeletal as my own future. I watched the first frost etch delicate, fern-like patterns on the glass, and then the first snow. It fell softly, silently, blanketing the world in a thick, white silence that perfectly mirrored the silence I was living in. The world outside was being erased, just as I had been. The worst part was the sounds. The attic floor was thin, and sound traveled up in distorted murmurs. I could hear the rhythm of the life I was no longer a part of. The cheerful ring of the telephone, the drone of the television in the evenings, the familiar cadence of my father's booming voice when he came home from work. One evening, a few weeks before Christmas, the sounds were louder, more festive, laughter. The clinking of glasses, the unmistakable murmur of a dinner party, they were entertaining. My parents were downstairs, perhaps just 30 feet below me, performing their roles as the perfect hosts, the pillars of the community. They were laughing and drinking and living their lie, while their daughter, their secret, was locked away in the cold, dusty darkness above, becoming a living ghost. I crawled onto my cot and pulled the thin blanket up to my chin. I pressed my hands against my stomach, feeling the undeniable, fluttering proof of the life that was growing within me. It was the only thing that felt real in my phantom existence. Listening to the phantom laughter from the world below, I looked at my distorted reflection in the dark, cold glass of the window, the silhouette of a stranger in a room full of ghosts. I had not just been locked away, I had been erased. And in the profound, absolute silence of my attic prison, a single desperate thought began to form. A thought that felt like a prayer, or perhaps a rebellion. I could not stay here. I would not die here. I had to find a way out. The decision to act was not a lightning strike of courage. It was a slow, quiet hardening of despair. It came from the endless nights spent listening to the wind howl outside my small window, a sound that was freer than I was. It came from the phantom laughter I heard from downstairs, a reminder of a world that had forgotten me. And it came from the secret, fluttering life inside me, a life that deserved more than to be born into the dusty silence of a prison. I would not let this attic become our tomb. My hope, when it finally arrived, came in the form of a faded postcard. During one of my long, empty afternoons, I had opened an old hatbox filled with my childhood memorabilia. school report cards, dried corsages, and a handful of photographs. At the bottom was a postcard of a ridiculously sunny beach in California, the ocean a shade of blue so vibrant it hurt my eyes. On the back, in loopy artistic handwriting, was a message. Dearest Lily, thinking of you. Don't ever let them dull your sparkle. All my love, Aunt Margaret. It was postmarked 5 years earlier. Aunt Margaret, my mother's younger sister. She was the family's cautionary tale, the black sheep who had escaped Havenwood for the sun-drenched wilds of the West Coast to become an artist. My mother rarely spoke of her, and when she did, her voice was laced with a tight, disapproving pity. Poor Margaret, she would sigh. So untethered. But I remembered Margaret from her rare visits when I was very young. She was a whirlwind of bright scarves and loud laughter, smelling of turpentine and strange, exotic perfumes. She had looked at me, really looked at me, and treated me not as a child to be molded, but as a person to be known. Don't let them dull your sparkle. She had seen a sparkle. Maybe somewhere it was still there. That night, my mission began. After my mother had collected my dinner tray and the house had settled into its deep, sleeping quiet, I began my search. I moved with a thief's stealth, my bare feet making no sound on the dusty floorboards. I rummaged through boxes of old Christmas decorations and stacks of yellowing newspapers, my heart pounding at every creak and groan of the old house. In a forgotten desk drawer, tucked beneath a stack of my mother's pristine linen stationery, I found it, an old leather-bound address book. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages, and there it was. Margaret Dubois, followed by an address in a place called Laguna Beach, California. Writing the letter was the hardest thing I had ever done. I had to do it in short bursts over several nights, huddled on the floor by the faint moonlight filtering through my window. I couldn't write the truth, not explicitly. The risk of my mother finding it was too great. The letter had to be a bottle thrown into the ocean, its message hidden in subtext, written in a code of shared memory and desperate hope. Dearest Aunt Margaret, I began, my pen scratching nervously on a piece of paper I'd carefully torn from an old school notebook. I hope this letter finds you well, and that the sun is shining in California. Mother mentioned you had written around my birthday, and I was so sorry to have missed it. As you may have heard, I've been quite unwell for some time now. The doctors say it's a bad case of mono, and I have to have complete rest. The days are very long and quiet up here in my room. Sometimes I feel much sicker than anyone knows. I feel terribly trapped by it all. I spend most of my time thinking about the stories you used to tell me about the ocean, about how big and endless it is. I think about that a lot lately. I don't know when I'll be well again, but I feel so very lonely, and I would give anything to see a bit of California sunshine right now. I read it over and over, praying she would understand, praying she would read the real words between the lines. I'm not sick. I'm a prisoner. I'm not lonely. I'm desperate. Help me. The final step was the most dangerous. I had to get the letter out of the house. My only chance was the grocery delivery boy, a lanky teenager named Jimmy, who came every Tuesday morning. I saved the $2 my mother had left on my tray for a paperback book I hadn't asked for. On Tuesday, I waited, my ear pressed against the attic floor, listening for the sound of his truck. When I heard the back door open and my mother's voice, I crept to my window. I managed to slide it open just a crack. As he was leaving, carrying the empty delivery crates, I hissed his name. Jimmy! He stopped, looking around in confusion. I waved the small folded letter from the window. His eyes widened when he saw me, a pale face in the high, dusty window of a house he thought was occupied only by Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. I pressed my finger to my lips, then held up the 2 folded dollar bills. Understanding dawned on his face. I tied the letter and the money to a piece of thread I'd pulled from my mattress and lowered it down. He snatched it from the air, shoved it deep into his pocket, gave me a quick, almost imperceptible nod, and hurried away. As I watched his truck disappear down the street, a new kind of waiting began. It was not the hollow, passive dread of the past months. It was a sharp, painful, terrifying hope. Every time the phone rang, my heart leaped into my throat. Every car that slowed on our street made me hold my breath. That letter was a prayer thrown into the void. I didn't know if it would ever be answered. But for the first time in months, I had done something that wasn't dictated by my father's rage or my mother's fear. I had done something for myself, and in the suffocating silence of the attic, that small act of rebellion felt like breathing again. The waiting was a new form of torture. Every day that passed without a word, the fragile hope that had bloomed in my chest began to wilt. I started to believe I had imagined it all, my aunt's kindness, the sparkle she saw in me, the chance of escape. Maybe my letter was lying at the bottom of a mail sack, or maybe it had arrived and been discarded, the ramblings of a troubled teenage girl. My prison walls, which had briefly seemed penetrable, began to feel solid and eternal once more. The answer, when it came, was not a letter. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, loud and alive and utterly out of place in the suffocating quiet of our home. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 months after I had sent my prayer into the void. I was lying on my cot, tracing the water stains on the ceiling, when I heard an unfamiliar car pull into the driveway. A moment later, the doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent chime that was rarely used. I heard my mother's hurried footsteps, the click of the front door, and then the voice, a whirlwind of sound and energy that cut through the stillness. "Eleanor, it's been too long. Margaret." My mother's voice was tight with shock and panic. "What on earth are you doing here?" "I didn't know you were coming." Clearly, my aunt's voice was dry, without its usual laughter. "I'm here to see my niece. I hear she's been terribly unwell." A beat of charged silence. "She can't have visitors," my mother said, her voice strained. "She needs absolute rest." "I'm not a visitor, Eleanor. I'm her aunt." "I'm going up to see her." The conversation that followed was a low, frantic murmur of my mother's protests and my aunt's firm, unyielding replies. And then I heard footsteps on the stairs, heavier and more determined than my mother's, my heart hammered against my ribs. The door to my attic prison swung open, and there she was. Aunt Margaret looked older, her vibrant red hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, and missing nothing. She took in the scene in a single sweeping glance, the dusty room, the meager furniture, and me, pale and enormous on the narrow cot. Her face for a moment was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She closed the door behind her, shutting out my mother, who hovered helplessly on the landing. "Oh, Lily," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. She crossed the room and gathered me into a hug that smelled of distant oceans and freedom. "The sunshine you wrote about," I understood. In the weeks that followed, my aunt became my secret co-conspirator. She announced to my mother that my illness required specialized care and that she would be staying to help. My mother, trapped between her fear of Richard and Margaret's steely resolve, and the unspoken threat that Margaret could expose the entire lie to the town, was rendered a passive, terrified accomplice. The birth, when it came, was a secret, whispered event in the dead of night, attended only by the steady, capable hands of my aunt. In the dust and shadows of the attic, my daughter was born. She was perfect, she was beautiful, and she was a secret that could not be kept. The exchange was set for a night 2 weeks later. The rain began in the afternoon, a cold, miserable drizzle that, by nightfall, had turned into a relentless downpour. It was a fitting, pathetic fallacy, the sky weeping the tears I could no longer shed. Margaret drove, her face grim and set, her focus entirely on the slick, dark road. I sat in the passenger seat, holding a precious, sleeping bundle in my arms. My daughter. I had wrapped her in my own baby blanket, a soft yellow flannel knitted by my grandmother, the only tangible piece of her history I could give her. We pulled into the parking lot of a desolate roadside motel called the Starlight, but half the letters in its neon sign were burnt out, so it just flickered Star HT into the rainy darkness. Another car was already there, its headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. "Margaret killed our engine." "They're here," she said softly. "Are you ready?" I wasn't. I never would be, but I nodded. A man in a trench coat holding a large black umbrella got out of the other car. He had a kind, tired face. He opened the back door, and a woman emerged, her own face pale and anxious in the gloom. The man was a lawyer Margaret had found. The woman was to be my daughter's mother. We did the exchange under the flimsy cover of the motel's leaking awning, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. The lawyer spoke in low, formal tones about papers and legality, his words a meaningless drone. All I could see was the woman's face. All I could feel was the warm, solid weight of my daughter in my arms. I looked down at her one last time, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the tiny shell of her ear, the impossibly small fingers curled into a fist. I leaned down and pressed my lips to her forehead, inhaling her scent of milk and innocence. In the quiet of my own heart, I gave her the only gift I could. I gave her a name that no one else would ever know. Hope. Then, I straightened up, and, with a slowness that felt like tearing my own soul in half, I placed my daughter into the other woman's waiting arms. For a moment, our eyes met. Two mothers, bound by a single child and an ocean of unspoken grief. She gave me a small, trembling nod of what looked like gratitude, or maybe pity. Then she turned, got back in the car, and was gone. The lawyer handed Margaret a thick envelope, nodded once at me, and retreated to his car. I stood there, my arms empty and aching, staring at the red taillights disappearing into the rain. I felt Margaret's hand on my back, firm and steady. "Come on, Lily," she said, her voice gentle but insistent. "We have to go. Don't look back." She guided me into the car, and we drove away in the opposite direction, the windshield wipers swishing back and forth, trying in vain to clear a view that would never be clear again. That night, I lost a daughter, but I gained a ghost named Hope, who would walk beside me, silent and unseen, for the rest of my life. The 60 years that followed my escape from Havenwood were a long, quiet expanse of carefully constructed peace. Aunt Margaret, true to her word, never left my side. She took me to California, to her small, sun-drenched bungalow that smelled of sea salt and oil paint. She helped me finish my education, held my hand through the silent, weeping nights, and never once asked me about the ghost I carried, though I know she saw it in my eyes. She gave me the space to build a life, and I built a fortress. I became a librarian, a custodian of other people's stories, a fitting profession for someone determined to keep their own locked away. I lived alone, I rarely dated, and I kept my heart guarded behind walls so high and thick that no one could ever breach them. It was a small, solitary life, but it was mine. It was safe. My mother and I maintained a polite, distant relationship conducted through yearly Christmas cards and stilted 5-minute phone calls on our birthdays. We never spoke of that time. It was a black hole in the center of our family's galaxy, and we orbited it carefully, pretending it wasn't there. When she passed away from cancer a decade ago, I went to her funeral, a quiet affair. I felt a pang of sorrow, not for the mother she was, but for the mother she might have been, the one I saw for a single fleeting second in the sewing room. Aunt Margaret passed 5 years after that, leaving me truly, finally alone with my ghost. And I thought that was how my story would end, in the quiet, orderly fortress I had built. Then 2 weeks ago, I received a phone call from a lawyer in Havenwood. My father, Richard Hayes, was dead. And I was named in his will, which is how I found myself here, back in the world of the Hayes family, sitting at a polished mahogany table in a sterile, air-conditioned law office. The room smelled of expensive leather and floor wax. Across from me sat my cousin Martha and her husband Bill. Martha, who had always modeled herself after my mother's prim perfection, offered me a look of practiced, syrupy sympathy. "It must be so hard for you, Lily," she murmured, her hand fluttering near mine, but not quite touching it. After all this time, Bill just nodded, his eyes, full of avarice, darting around the room. They weren't here to mourn, they were here to collect. I was merely a piece of the scenery, the tragic spinster cousin, a curiosity from the past. I remained silent, my hands folded calmly in my lap, the picture of quiet composure. It was a mask I had perfected over a lifetime. The lawyer, a young man named Mr. Peterson who looked barely 30, cleared his throat and began to read. The legalese was dense, but the intent was clear. My father's final act was the construction of his own monument. He left large, impressive sums to the Havenwood Presbyterian Church, the Veterans of Foreign Wars Post, the town's Little League. The list went on. He was posthumously painting himself as the town's greatest philanthropist, the sainted Richard Hayes, a man of unimpeachable character and generosity. I could feel Martha and Bill growing restless, their hopes of a large inheritance dwindling with every charitable bequest. Then Mr. Peterson paused. "And finally," he said, adjusting his glasses, "to my daughter, Lily Hayes." The room fell silent. I felt Martha's sharp, curious gaze on me. "To my daughter Lily," the lawyer read, his voice dispassionate, "whose path in life has been a source of private concern for me, I leave the sum of $5,000. I registered a small, disappointed sigh from Martha. But it was the next line, the final line, that was the true inheritance. "It is my sincerest hope," Mr. Peterson continued, reading my father's words, "that this small sum may help her find some measure of peace from the lifelong melancholia that has so sadly afflicted her." The words hung in the sterile air of the room. Lifelong melancholia. He had done it. From beyond the grave, he had delivered his final public verdict on my life. He had taken the unspeakable trauma he had inflicted upon me and repackaged it as a quaint, feminine sadness, a character flaw. He had dismissed my 60 years of silent, agonizing grief as a personality quirk. It was a public branding, a final, cruel act of control designed to frame him as the concerned father and me as his tragic, troubled daughter. The humiliation was absolute, delivered with the cold, undeniable finality of a legal document. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I felt a profound and terrifying stillness settle over me. It was the stillness of a frozen lake just before the ice begins to crack. I could feel Martha's pitying gaze, see the smug satisfaction in Bill's eyes. They had received nothing, but they had gotten to witness this, my final public shaming. "Well," Martha said, patting my hand with a sigh that was pure performance. "That was a lovely thought, dear. He was always so worried about you." I rose from my chair, my movements calm and deliberate. I nodded once to the lawyer and walked out of the office, leaving my relatives to whisper in my wake. I stepped out into the noise and bustle of the city street, but I heard nothing. The fortress I had built around my heart had not just been breached. It had been firebombed, but the attack hadn't broken me. It had revealed something underneath the ruins, something that had been buried for 60 years. Rage. Not the hot, screaming rage of youth, but a cold, clear, diamond-hard anger. He had tried to write the end of my story, to define me forever with his self-serving lie. He thought his words would be the last. Standing on that busy sidewalk, with the ghost of hope at my side, I made a different decision. I was done being silent. I was done being a ghost, and I would be the one to write the final chapter. That night, the quiet of my house felt different. For 60 years, it had been the sound of peace, the sound of safety. Now, it was the sound of a held breath before a plunge. The words from my father's will echoed in the stillness. Lifelong melancholia. A neat, dismissive label for a wound that had shaped my entire existence. The rage I felt upon leaving the lawyer's office had not dissipated. It had cooled and clarified, settling deep within me like a shard of ice. He thought he had written my epilogue. He had no idea he had just given me a prologue. I couldn't settle. I paced the familiar rooms of my small house, the fortress that suddenly felt too small. The past was not in the past. It was a living, breathing entity in the room with me. And it wasn't just my father's ghost that haunted me. It was my mother's. Her complicity, her fearful silence, her role as the architect of my prison, it all felt as fresh and painful as my father's final public cruelty. I needed something. I didn't know what. A connection. An answer. I found myself climbing the pull-down stairs to my own attic, a space I rarely visited, a place for storage, not ghosts. In the corner, under a dusty canvas sheet, was a trunk. It was my mother's. After she died, I had packed away the few personal belongings she'd left behind, unable to either keep them or discard them. Now I needed to look inside. I unlatched the rusty clasps, the screech of metal loud in the silence. The scent of her life, faint lavender sachet and old paper, rose to meet me. Inside was the ephemera of her carefully controlled world. Her pristine white gloves, folded neatly, a silver thimble worn smooth from a lifetime of mending. Her recipe book, the pages stained with vanilla and butter, her handwriting a perfect, disciplined script. It was the life she had shown the world. And then I saw it. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of neatly ironed handkerchiefs, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed, the flap simply tucked in. My name, Lily, was written on the front in her familiar hand, but the letters were shaky, spidery, the writing of someone old and unwell. My breath caught. My hands, which had been so steady all day, began to tremble. I sat down on the dusty floor of the attic, the single bare bulb overhead casting long shadows, and I opened the letter. My dearest Lily, the shaky script began. If you are reading this, then I have been a coward to the very end, and God has not granted me the final mercy of seeing you one last time to say these words myself. I am so sorry. Those are small, useless words for a chasm of failure, but they are the only ones I have left. I know you have spent your life hating me. You have the right. I want you to know, not as an excuse but as a reason, that he broke me long before you were born. The man the town saw, the charming man at the hardware store, was a mask. The man I lived with was a creature of such terrifying moods that I learned to live my life trying to placate him, to become so small and agreeable that his rage would pass over me. I lived in terror. And when his attention turned to you, my terror did not make me brave, it made me a traitor. I heard you cry the night he broke your music box. I lay in my bed, my fists clenched under the covers, and I did nothing. I chose my own safety over yours. It is a sin for which I know I will never be forgiven, not by you and not by God. My vision blurred with tears I didn't know I had left to shed. This was the confession I had waited a lifetime to hear. I read on, my heart pounding. And then, the baby. My beautiful secret grandchild. I was the one who forced your hand, Lily. I was the one who told you there was no other way. He demanded it. He said he would not have his life, his reputation, ruined. He made me find a man, a lawyer in Chicago, to make it all disappear. He wanted every trace of it gone. The man's name was Arthur Coleman. I believe his office was on LaSalle Street. I have lived with the ghost of that baby every day, just as I know you have. I see her face in my sleep. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. A name, a place. It was a detail so concrete, so real, it seemed to vibrate on the page. The letter ended with one final, desperate plea. I have given you the truth, Lily, a truth I was too weak to speak while I was alive. And now I must ask you to do what I could not. Let it be over. Let the secrets die with me. Please, for the memory of the mother who did love you, in her own broken, terrible way, I beg you, burn this letter. Don't let it bring any more pain. I sat there in the dusty silence of the attic for a long time, the letter resting in my lap. The rage I felt towards my father was now complicated by this wave of pity and sorrow for my mother. She was a victim, too, in her own way. But her final act, this letter, was not what she thought it was. It wasn't just a confession. It wasn't just an apology. It was a map. It was a key. It was a weapon handed to me from the grave. I looked at her final words. I beg you, burn this. My hands were steady now. I carefully, deliberately, folded the fragile pages and slipped them back into the envelope. I did not burn it. I would not let the secrets die. I would not grant her final, cowardly wish. I would, instead, honor the truth she had finally given me. Her confession would not be an end. It would be my beginning. The day after I found my mother's letter, I woke up a different woman. The lifelong melancholia my father had so generously diagnosed had been burned away overnight, cauterized by the cold, clean flame of purpose. The fortress I had built for 60 years was not a ruin. It was an armory. And my mother, in her last desperate act, had handed me the sharpest sword imaginable. I made the phone call that morning, my voice a model of calm composure. It was my cousin Martha I called, the self-appointed matriarch of the family's remnants. Martha, it's Lily. Lily, dear, are you all right after everything? Her voice was thick with the same condescending pity from the lawyer's office. I'm perfectly fine, I said, my tone crisp and businesslike. I'm calling because I believe it's time we all met at the house to discuss the final arrangements for the sale. There are some personal effects to consider. I think it would be best to have one final family meeting. The bait was taken instantly. The mention of personal effects and assets was irresistible. Oh yes, of course, dear. That's a very sensible idea, she said, her voice brightening. When were you thinking? We set a date for the end of the week. The drive to Havenwood was like traveling back in time. The highways were new, but the rolling Pennsylvania hills were the same. As I passed the familiar green sign, "Welcome to Havenwood, a great place to raise a family," a bitter laugh escaped my lips. I drove down Main Street, past the old hardware store, now a yoga studio. The past was everywhere, but for the first time, it held no power over me. I was not a frightened girl running away. I was a woman returning to settle a debt. I was the first to arrive at the house on Hemlock Lane. I let myself in with the key the estate lawyer had given me. The house was cold and hollow. The furniture was gone, leaving pale rectangles on the faded wallpaper where pictures once hung. White sheets, like sad, lumpy ghosts, covered the few remaining pieces. The air was stale with the smell of dust and disuse. This was the stage. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing. I stood in the living room, right where the perfect family portrait used to hang. I ran my hand along the dusty fireplace mantel. I felt no fear. I felt no nostalgia. I felt only a profound sense of clarity. Martha and Bill arrived 20 minutes later, bustling in with an air of self-importance. They were followed by Martha's brother David, a man who had inherited my father's booming voice, but none of his charisma. They chattered about property values and realtor fees, their eyes scanning the empty rooms, mentally appraising the fixtures. "It's a shame about the water stains in the dining room," Bill said, tapping a wall with his knuckle. "That'll knock a few thousand off the asking price." They treated me as a peripheral figure, a ghost in my own history, and I let them. We gathered in the empty living room. Bill pulled out a notepad ready to talk numbers. I let them settle, then I walked to the center of the room, to the very spot where my life had been decided by others time and time again. "Thank you all for coming," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through their greedy chatter and commanded the room. They looked at me, surprised. "Before we discuss the sale, there is a piece of family business we must attend to. A final matter from my mother." I reached into my handbag and pulled out the old, cream-colored envelope. The sight of it, ancient and intimate, silenced them completely. A look of confusion passed over Martha's face. "My mother," I continued, my voice steady as a surgeon's hand, "left a letter for me, a final confession. And I feel that you, as the remaining members of this family, have a right to hear the truth of the foundation upon which this house, and our family's good name, was built." I carefully unfolded the fragile yellowed pages, and I began to read. I read my mother's words about living in terror of the man they all revered. I read about the night he broke my music box, and Martha's hand flew to her mouth in a theatrical gasp. I read about my mother's shame, her complicity, her fear. David shifted uncomfortably, his face losing its color, and then I read the words that would bring their world crashing down. I read about the secret pregnancy. I read about my father's cold fury, his refusal to have his reputation ruined, and his demand that my mother find a man to make it all disappear. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence, the kind that follows an explosion, when all the air has been sucked out of a space. The image of the sainted Richard Hayes, the generous philanthropist, the pillar of the community, had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. Bill stared at the floor, his notepad forgotten in his lap. David looked pale and nauseous. It was Martha who finally broke the silence, her voice a reedy, disbelieving whisper. That can't be true. Uncle Richard, he wouldn't—" I folded the letter neatly and looked directly at her, my gaze as hard and unyielding as granite. "It is my mother's dying wish that I burn this letter and let the secrets die," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "But I find I cannot." This house, this family, was built on a foundation of lies. I just thought you should all know the truth before you start dividing up the assets. I didn't wait for their stammered apologies or their horrified accusations. My work here was done. I turned, my back straight, and walked out of the living room, leaving them sitting there in the ruins of their own history. I walked through the empty hallway, out the front door, and did not look back. As I got into my car and drove away from Havenwood for what I knew would be the final time, I felt the weight of 60 years of silence lift from my shoulders. I had not buried the truth. I had replanted it in their laps, leaving them to choke on its bitter roots. Destroying the foundation of lies in Havenwood had been a necessary act of demolition. I had leveled the hollow structure that had imprisoned me. But in the days that followed, as I sat in the restored quiet of my own home, I realized that standing in the rubble of the past does not build a future. The cold, clear rage had served its purpose. Now a new feeling was taking its place, a terrifying, tremulous hope. My mother's letter lay on the table beside me. I had read it a dozen times, but now my eyes skipped over the painful confessions and landed on two simple, electrifying facts. Arthur Coleman. Chicago. For 60 years my daughter had been a nameless, faceless ghost, a creature of my own grief. Now she had a potential geography, a possible history. The letter was no longer a weapon against my family. It was a map pointing toward my own heart. The thought of following it was more frightening than any confrontation with the past. Confronting my cousins was about ending something. This was about possibly beginning something. And beginnings were a territory I had not dared to enter for a lifetime. I knew I couldn't do it alone. I spent a day online, not searching for my daughter, but for a lawyer. I didn't want a venerable, old-school attorney who might see me as a sentimental old woman. I needed someone young, someone with a fire in their belly, someone who might still believe in impossible things. I found a small firm in the city, and the photograph of a junior partner, a Mr. Davies, caught my eye. He had a kind, earnest face. I made an appointment. When I sat in his modern, glass-walled office, I didn't begin with the legalities. I began with the story. I told him everything, my voice as calm and steady as it had been in my father's empty house. I spoke of the attic, of the rain-soaked motel, of the ghost I had named Hope. I watched his professional demeanor slowly melt away, replaced by a look of profound human empathy. Finally, I slid my mother's letter, now protected in a plastic sleeve, across his desk. He read it in silence, his brow furrowed. When he finished, he looked up at me, and his voice was gentle. "Lily," he said, using my first name for the first time. "This is an incredible long shot. Records from that era are often sealed permanently, if they even still exist. The lawyer, Arthur Coleman, has been deceased for over 30 years. "I know," I said, my hand steady in my lap. "But a long shot is the only one I have. I need to know what happened to her. I need to know if she had a good life." That's all. He took the case. For the next several weeks, my life was a quiet agony of waiting. Mr. Davies would call with small updates. He was petitioning the court in Cook County. He was tracking down the archives of Arthur Coleman's defunct law firm. He was hitting one bureaucratic brick wall after another. With each call, I prepared myself for failure, reminding myself that just trying was more than I had allowed myself for 60 years. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, the phone rang. "Lily? It's Mark Davies." His voice was different. It held a new energy, a tremor of excitement he couldn't contain. I think I've found her." The world tilted. I had to sit down on the edge of my armchair, the phone pressed hard against my ear. 60 years of wondering, of grieving a ghost, all culminating in this single, unbelievable sentence. "Her name is Sarah Jenkins," Mr. Davies continued, speaking quickly. "The adoption was private, just as you said." The Jenkins were a wonderful couple by all accounts. They gave her a loving home. They passed away several years ago. "She's an architect, very successful. She lives right here in Chicago." "Is she? Does she know?" I whispered, my voice failing me. "I approached her carefully," he said. his tone becoming gentle again. I told her I was a lawyer representing a party in an estate matter that concerned her birth history. I didn't mention you by name. I just said that her birth mother was alive and had spent a lifetime hoping she was well. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable rejection, the anger, the door slamming shut on this last impossible hope. She was shocked, Mr. Davies said. Completely shaken. She said she always knew she was adopted and that she'd had a wonderful life, but that there was always a missing piece, a question mark she never thought would be answered. She's not angry, Lily. She's curious. My hand flew to my mouth, stifling a sob that had been waiting 60 years to escape. She needs some time to process it, of course, he continued, but she said she's willing to meet. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. Meet, a meeting, with a stranger who held my entire heart in her hands. She has agreed to meet you, Lily, Mr. Davies said, his voice full of a gentle triumph on my behalf. She suggested a quiet cafe near her office. Next Thursday, a date on a calendar, a knock on a stranger's door, not with my hand, but with my presence. The ghost I had carried for a lifetime was about to have a face, and I had no idea if I would find a daughter, a stranger, or just a reflection of a wound that could never truly be healed. The week leading up to Thursday was the longest of my life. 60 years of waiting had been an abstract, timeless grief. 7 days of waiting for a specific scheduled meeting with a ghost who now had a name and an address was a particular kind of exquisite torture. I found myself standing in front of my closet for an hour at a time, wondering what a mother wears to meet the daughter she gave away. Everything I owned felt old, drab, inadequate. How could I, a quiet librarian in a beige cardigan, present myself to a successful Chicago architect? I was a relic from a past she never knew, a past of shame and fear. What could I possibly offer her? The morning of the trip, I felt a nausea that was a haunting echo of a sickness from long ago. The train ride to Chicago was a blur. The city, when I arrived, was a roaring, overwhelming beast of glass and steel. It felt like another planet compared to my quiet suburban life. I took a taxi to the cafe Mr. Davies had indicated, a place called the Gilded Cup. I arrived 45 minutes early. I chose a small table in a quiet corner, a place where I could see the door. I ordered a chamomile tea, and my hands trembled so much as I lifted the cup that the hot liquid sloshed into the saucer. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my heart leaped into my throat. What would she look like? What would I say? Would she look at me and see only a week-old woman who had abandoned her? And then, at precisely 2 o'clock, she walked in. I knew it was her before I even saw her face clearly. It was the way she held herself, with a confident, easy grace that I had never possessed. She was tall, dressed in a smart, dark pantsuit, her hair cut in a stylish, modern bob. She paused just inside the door, her eyes scanning the cafe, and beneath the composed, professional exterior, I saw it, a flicker of raw, searching vulnerability. Our eyes met across the room. I saw my own eyes staring back at me, the same shape, the same shade of gray, but hers were filled with a light and a life that had been extinguished in mine long ago. I gave a small, hesitant nod. She walked towards my table, her steps measured and deliberate. "Lily?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "Sarah," I whispered, the name feeling both strange and sacred on my lips. She sat down. The silence that fell between us was not empty. It was a dense, heavy thing, filled with 60 years of unspoken words, unasked questions, and unimaginable distance. The cheerful chatter of the cafe, the clinking of cups, all of it faded away. There was only the woman across from me, a stranger who had been born of my body. I knew the burden was mine to bear. I had to be the one to bridge the chasm. I took a shaky breath. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice barely audible. "I know this must be a terrible shock." She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving my face, studying me with an unnerving intensity. And so, I told her. I told her the story, not as a plea for pity or an excuse for my actions, but as a simple offering of truth. I told her of the perfect family in the photograph and the silent terror that lived behind its frame. I told her of the attic, of the fear, of the profound lack of choice. I told her I was 16 years old and completely, utterly alone. As I spoke, I saw the careful composure on her face begin to crack. I saw the dawning horror in her eyes as she began to understand the violent, secret world from which she had been saved. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, just looking at me. Finally, I reached for the one truth that was truly mine to give. "There is something else," I said, my voice trembling. "When you were born, in the attic, I gave you a name. It was just for me, a secret. No one else in the world ever knew it." I looked directly into her eyes, my own now brimming with tears. "I called you Hope." That was the word that broke her. Her composure shattered completely. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. The name hung in the air between us, a fragile 60-year-old dream that had just been spoken into reality. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in tissue paper. I pushed it gently across the table towards her. "This was mine when I was a baby," I said softly. "My grandmother knitted it. I wrapped you in it before I let you go. I wanted you to have a piece of us, a piece of the truth." Her hands, which were as steady as my own, were trembling, reached out and unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay the small, faded yellow baby blanket. She touched it reverently, her fingers tracing the delicate pattern, a tangible link to a past she never knew, to a mother she never had. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She looked up from the blanket, her eyes full of a complex storm of emotions, grief, confusion, a dawning understanding. And then she did something that unmade me. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her touch was warm and firm. A simple gesture of connection that bridged 60 years of silence. We sat like that for a long time. Eventually, it was she who spoke, her voice thick with emotion. I need some time to think about all of this," she said. "But thank you for telling me. It was not a promise." It was not forgiveness. It was not a fairy tale reunion with joyous hugs. It was something more real, more precious. It was the raw, painful, beautiful beginning of understanding. We left the cafe and stood awkwardly on the busy Chicago sidewalk, two strangers bound by the most intimate of ties. We said a quiet, clumsy goodbye, and she walked away, a woman I had met only an hour ago, carrying my history in her handbag. I watched her go until she disappeared into the crowd, and for the first time, the ghost beside me had a face, a name, and a future. I am back in my armchair, in the quiet of my living room. The grandfather clock in the hall chimes the hour, its voice deep and familiar. The dust motes still dance in the afternoon light. On the mantelpiece, the old black and white photograph still stands in its silver frame, a monument to a perfect family that never was. I have looked at it 1,000 times, but today, I see it differently. I no longer see just a trapped little girl with a forced smile. I see the beginning of a long, hard road, a road that led me out of the darkness. The meeting in the cafe was not an end. It was a beginning, but a fragile and terrifying one. For 60 years, hope had been a perfect, tragic idea in my mind. Sarah was a real person, a person with her own life, her own memories, her own wounds. There were no joyful tears and instant embraces. Our new relationship was built slowly, carefully, over weeks and then months of tentative phone calls and awkward cups of coffee. We did not try to reclaim the lost roles of mother and daughter. That would have been a lie of a different kind. Instead, we did something braver. We got to know each other. Two strangers, bound by blood and trauma, slowly learning to navigate the geography of a shared history. She learned about the girl who loved to read in a quiet bedroom. I learned about the woman who loved to build beautiful, solid things from steel and glass. She told me about her parents, the Jenkins, and the kind, loving home they gave her. I listened, my heart filled with a profound and painful gratitude for them. And I told her my story. The whole story. Not just the parts that were tragic, but the small parts too. The memory of my grandmother's lullaby, the smell of my mother's cinnamon buns, The simple, beautiful things that existed alongside the horror. I was giving her back her own past, piece by painful piece. And in telling her, I was finally telling myself. I look at the old photograph on the mantel, at the ghost of the little girl I once was. My story is finished. I have carried it alone for so long, a terrible, heavy burden. But the silence is broken now. The story has been told. A hand, warm and strong, gently squeezes mine. I turn my head from the mantelpiece and look at the woman sitting in the armchair beside me. She has been listening to me tell it, right here, in the quiet of my living room. She has heard every word. Her eyes, which are my eyes, are filled with a deep, sad understanding. She offers me a small, gentle smile, and I smile back. My gaze drifts back to the mantel. The old black and white photograph does not stand alone anymore. Next to it, in a simple wooden frame, is a new photograph, this one in brilliant color. It was taken last spring in the public gardens. In it, an elderly woman with silver hair and a middle-aged woman with a stylish bob are sitting on a bench, side by side. They are not embracing. They are simply sitting together, smiling into the sunshine. The smiles are not perfect. They do not hide the 60 years of loss and silence that lie between them. But they are real. For 60 years, I was a ghost in my own life. A secret keeper. But a secret is a poison that you drink hoping someone else will die. The truth doesn't always heal you. It doesn't erase the scars or bring back the lost years. But it sets you free. My name is Lily Hayes, and I am no longer silent. And beside me, holding my hand, is my daughter, my hope, my Sarah.